In the fall of 1961, soldiers from Wisconsin dairy farms and Michigan factory floors were suddenly pulled out of their civilian lives, handed their gear, and told to get ready to cross the Atlantic and defend a city surrounded on all sides by Soviet forces. That city was Berlin. Today, we're breaking down the Berlin crisis, specifically how a divided city became the most dangerous flashpoint on Earth, what legal and military machinery Kennedy had to build almost from scratch to respond, and what the 32nd Red Arrow Division's mobilization actually tells us about how deterrence really works. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why Berlin mattered so much, and why a National Guard division from the American Midwest became one of the most important arrows in Kennedy's quiver. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this record, and I want to start with something that I think a lot of people just don't fully grasp, so walk me in. How did Berlin end up in this impossible situation in the first place?
So the setup is almost absurdly complicated, and it starts not with the Cold War, but with the end of World War II. When the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, the Allied powers, the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, and France, had already agreed at Tehran in 1943 and at Yalta in February 1945 that Germany would be jointly occupied. Not permanently divided, but jointly administrated as a kind of trusteeship while they figured out what a post-Nazi Germany would look like.
Right, so the plan was always cooperation, not partition.
Exactly. But here's the thing that makes Berlin so uniquely strange. The city sat more than 100 miles inside the area assigned to Soviet occupation. The Red Army had done the bulk of the fighting on the Eastern Front, and by April 1945 it was Soviet forces who encircled and stormed Berlin. Militarily, the Soviets controlled the city entirely, but politically, the Allies had already agreed that the capital would be jointly administered.
So the Soviets won the battle for Berlin, but had to share the prize.
Precisely. And that arrangement wasn't about fairness. It was a deliberate attempt to prevent any single power, especially the Soviet Union, from monopolizing the symbolic and administrative center of Germany. The Allied Control Council was created to govern Germany as a whole, with each of the four powers administering its own zone. Berlin, though located entirely within the Soviet zone, was carved into four sectors mirroring that larger structure. The Soviets took the eastern sector, the Americans, British, and French divided the western half.
And that arrangement was always going to be fragile.
Completely artificial and completely fragile. The Allied Control Council required unanimity for major decisions, which meant it was paralyzed almost immediately as the wartime alliance started to fray. The Soviets wanted to shape their zone into a socialist state aligned with Moscow. The Western Allies were pushing political pluralism and economic recovery. And Berlin reflected that paralysis in miniature. The city's municipal government split along ideological lines. Its police forces divided. Its economic administration fractured.
So West Berlin became this liberal democratic island inside a communist state.
That's exactly the phrase used to describe it. A liberal democratic island embedded within a communist state. And that description isn't just poetic. It had real, daily consequences for the people living there. West Berlin was more prosperous, more politically open, more connected to the wider world than the socialist East. And that contrast became a massive problem for the Soviet bloc.
Because people could see the difference and vote with their feet.
Exactly. As the GDR tightened political control and collectivized its economy, hundreds of thousands of East Germans used Berlin's open border to flee westward. By the mid-1950s, the refugee flow had become what the record describes as a hemorrhage. It was undermining the legitimacy and the labor force of the East German state. And here's where it gets really interesting, because before we get to the wall, there's this earlier crisis that sets the whole pattern.
The 1948 blockade.
Right. On June 24, 1948, the Soviets sealed all rail, road, and canal routes into West Berlin. The trigger was the Western decision to introduce a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in their occupation zones. The Soviets responded by trying to force the Western powers out of the city through starvation and isolation. Instead, the United States and Britain launched the Berlin Airlift, flying supplies into the city entirely by air.
And the scale of that operation is staggering when you actually look at the numbers.
It really is. Aircraft were landing every few minutes at Tempelhof and Gatow, and the operation eventually delivered more than 2 million tons of cargo, food, coal, medicine, fuel. The airlift continued even after the Soviets lifted the blockade on May 12, 1949, just to build up stockpiles and ensure Berlin's continued security. The blockade failed completely, but it cemented the political geography of the Cold War.
You know, there's this detail from the airlift that I find almost impossible to believe. American pilots, led by a Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, started dropping small parachutes of chocolate and candy to Berlin children as they approached the runways. They called them candy bombs. In the middle of this massive strategic standoff, you've got pilots making tiny parachutes out of handkerchiefs and dropping sweets to kids.
And that detail matters more than it might seem, because it shows that the airlift wasn't only a strategic operation, it was a humanitarian one. Those candy bombs became symbols of hope. They showed Berliners that the Americans weren't just there to play geopolitical chess, they were there for the people. That kind of signal is actually part of how deterrence works. You're not just demonstrating military capability, you're demonstrating commitment.
So the blockade fails, the airlift succeeds, and then what? How do we get from 1949 to the wall in 1961?
A lot happens in between, and some of it is genuinely wild. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear weapon, Jo-1, named after Stalin. That changes everything. And then Stalin dies in 1953, and Khrushchev begins maneuvering for power. By 1955 to 1956, he's consolidated authority, and his first major foreign policy move is to denounce Stalin's terror and cult of personality, which was not just ideological housekeeping. It was a signal to the world that the USSR would pursue a different strategic posture.
Peaceful coexistence.
That's what he called it. Khrushchev's attempt to reduce direct military confrontation with the West while competing politically, economically, and ideologically. The record actually describes him as Gorbachev before Gorbachev was cool. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets almost darkly funny. This peaceful coexistence doctrine was being promoted by a man who, at the United Nations on October 12, 1960, removed his shoe and banged it on the podium while berating the Philippine delegation.
Wait, he actually did that? Like, took his shoe off?
According to multiple contemporary reports, yes. The session was debating colonialism, and the Philippine delegate Lorenzo Sumulong correctly criticized Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, equating it to neo-colonialism. Khrushchev erupted, shouting insults, pounding his fists, and removing his shoe and banging it on his desk. And it wasn't an isolated incident. In the same session, he did the same thing at pushback from the representative from the Congo. This is the man who was simultaneously threatening, quote, "We will bury you," at predictable opportunities throughout the 1950s.
So when Kennedy sits down with this guy in Vienna in June 1961, he's not dealing with a rational actor in the traditional diplomatic sense.
Kennedy returned from Vienna convinced that the Soviets intended to force a showdown. Khrushchev renewed his threat to sign a separate peace treaty with the GDR, which would allow East Germany to control Western access routes to Berlin. And the refugee situation was still hemorrhaging. By 1961, the pressure on Khrushchev to do something about the open border in Berlin had become unbearable. So on August 13, 1961, the Soviets suddenly began construction of the Berlin Wall.
And that's the moment Kennedy has to respond. Right. But to understand how Kennedy responded, you have to understand a legal and constitutional problem that had been building for decades. Because here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Before 1947, the United States had a serious structural vulnerability. The Constitution, as originally written, prohibited the federal government from maintaining a standing army in times of peace. That was a 17th century safeguard that made sense when crossing the Atlantic took 3 months.
3 months. And by the time of the Cold War, a Soviet bomber could reach the East Coast in hours.
Exactly. The record traces this really vividly. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic in 33 hours and 30 minutes. But it wasn't even Lindbergh's flight that forced Washington to act. It was the Kaiser's unrestricted submarine warfare during World War I that first raised the alarm. And then FDR refused to act, citing constitutional restrictions. It took Truman, who had ordered the use of nuclear weapons and knew the Soviets had moles inside the Los Alamos project, to finally push through the 1947 National Security Act.
which created the Department of Defense and the CIA in one stroke.
In one stroke of Truman's pen, yes. And to stay consistent with the Constitution's prohibition on a standing army, Congress had to explicitly authorize the continued existence of the Department of Defense every single year through the National Defense Authorization Act. That's not a technicality, that's the constitutional architecture that Kennedy was working within when he needed to mobilize forces for Berlin.
So when Kennedy decides to federalize the National Guard, he's not just making a military decision, he's pulling on this whole legal framework that had only been built 14 years earlier.
And those statutes were, as the record puts it, brand new and altogether untested. The key provisions were Title 10 of the United States Code, specifically 10 U.S.C. Section 672, which allowed the president to order reserve components to active duty for up to 24 months in a declared national emergency. There was also the Reserve Forces Act of 1955, which clarified the conditions under which National Guard units could be federalized for overseas deployment. Kennedy used all of it.
Walk me through the sequence. What did Kennedy actually do and when?
On July 25, 1961, Kennedy delivered a nationally televised address announcing increased defense spending, expansion of the army, and the mobilization of reserve forces. The planning was coordinated through the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer, and they identified several Guard divisions as potential reinforcements for U.S. Army Europe, what was called USAREUR. Among those identified was the 32nd Infantry Division, the Red Arrow, composed primarily of Wisconsin National Guard units with additional elements from Michigan.
And the Red Arrow had a serious combat record going into this.
Distinguished is the word. The division had a combat record from the First World War and the Pacific campaigns of the Second World War, and it retained a strong organizational identity in the post-war Guard structure. So when Kennedy signed the federalization order on October 15, 1961, he wasn't reaching for a symbolic unit, he was reaching for a division with real institutional depth and a proven identity.
So what happens next? Where do the Red Arrows actually go?
The bulk of the division moved to Fort Lewis, Washington, which became the Red Arrow's primary mobilization and training base. Fort Lewis had the infrastructure needed to bring a Guard division up to active duty standards, expanded ranges, modern barracks, proximity to the logistical pipelines that would carry a combat formation to Europe. And the training there was intense. Marksmanship, field exercises, communications integration, rapid deployment drills, cold weather operations, urban defense, transatlantic embarkation procedures.
Urban defense. So they were specifically training for what a fight in Berlin might actually look like. Skills tailored to the terrain and tactical realities of Central Europe, as the record puts it. But Kennedy and the Pentagon understood that Berlin required more than a division waiting in reserve at Fort Lewis. It required visible, immediate reinforcement to signal American resolve. So selected elements of the 32nd were detached from the main body and sent directly to Germany, with a smaller contingent moving into Berlin itself.
Wait, so parts of the division actually went into Berlin? A contingent, yes. Not large enough to constitute a brigade, but carefully chosen. Communications specialists, liaison officers, logistics planners, infantry cadres capable of integrating with USAREUR units already in theatre. Their mission was twofold: augment existing American forces and serve as advance parties, preparing billets, supply channels, and operational plans so that the full Red Arrow division could enter Germany and, if necessary, Berlin, without delay or confusion.
So they were essentially setting the table for a much larger force that might follow.
Exactly. And the Berlin-based contingent had an even more delicate assignment. They were not there to fight, they were there to prepare the ground for the possibility that the 32nd would be committed to the city. Coordinating with the Berlin Brigade, mapping out reception points, understanding the sector boundaries, ensuring that if the order came, the Red Arrows could move from ports of entry to defensive positions with minimal friction.
And their presence itself was a message.
That's the part I find most fascinating about this whole episode. A National Guard division's forward elements in Berlin signaled that the United States was prepared to escalate its commitment beyond the regular army, drawing on the full depth of its reserve structure. And back at Fort Lewis, the rest of the division trained with the knowledge that they might be called upon to reinforce Europe at any moment. The record describes Kennedy as having bent his bow, affixed its string, and knocked the Red Arrows in full view of Soviet spies on the West Coast.
That image is striking. The strategic value wasn't necessarily in deploying the division, it was in making sure Moscow knew it could be deployed.
And that's the core logic of deterrence in the nuclear age. Nuclear parity made direct confrontation catastrophic for both sides, but credible conventional forces were essential to prevent Soviet coercion. If Khrushchev believed that cutting off access to Berlin would be met only with nuclear escalation or nothing at all, he might gamble on the West blinking. The Red Arrows closed that gap. They said, "We have a middle option, and it's real, and it's ready."
It's almost a paradox. You mobilize to avoid having to fight. That's exactly what it is. And it worked. The crisis stabilized before the full division was deployed. The wall stood, that was a concession the West ultimately accepted, but the standoff cooled, and the Red Arrows returned home without crossing the Atlantic as a complete formation. By early 1962, the 32nd had fully returned to its peacetime status, resuming its role as Wisconsin's primary National Guard division.
But the mobilization itself left a mark.
A lasting one. The Red Arrows had demonstrated that a Guard division could be brought to active duty readiness rapidly and effectively. Their brief but intense activation became part of the division's modern identity, a reminder that even in peacetime, the Guard stands as a strategic reserve, capable of answering the nation's call when history tightens its grip. The record puts it well. Readiness of archer, of bow, and of quiver is the cornerstone on which the Red Arrow's legend stands.
So when you step back from all of this, the divided city, the airlift, the wall, the mobilization, what does this whole arc actually tell us?
It tells us that Berlin was never really about Berlin. It was about what Berlin represented, the credibility of Western commitment, the viability of liberal democracy as an alternative to Soviet socialism, and the question of whether the United States could actually project power in the nuclear age without triggering a nuclear exchange. Every crisis in Berlin, from the blockade of 1948 to the wall in 1961, grew out of that original arrangement, a Western-controlled territory inside the Soviet zone.
And the 32nd Red Arrow was the answer to that question in 1961. They were the proof of concept that a nation which had, just 14 years earlier, been constitutionally prohibited from maintaining a standing army could mobilize a full Guard division, train it to active duty standards, forward deploy elements into the most sensitive city on Earth, and do all of it fast enough to matter. That's not a small thing. That's the entire logic of the reserve structure working exactly as intended.
And there's something almost poignant about the soldiers themselves. Guys from Wisconsin dairy farms and Michigan factories, living for months under the assumption that they might be sent to defend a city they'd probably never visited, in a country they'd only read about.
The record captures that really well. By August 1962, the men of the 32nd were home again, scattered back across Wisconsin's towns and farms, still shaking off the long months at Fort Lewis, its rain-slick parade grounds, its endless field problems, its sense of being held taut for a fight that never quite came. Their federal service ended, the Berlin standoff eased, and Washington exhaled.
And yet the story doesn't end there.
Not even close. Even as the Red Arrows resumed their civilian rhythms, returning to factories, classrooms, and dairy barns, the Soviet premier was already shifting pieces on a different board. In late summer of 1962, while Wisconsin soldiers were reacclimating to ordinary life, the first Soviet freighters, laden with what was described as agricultural machinery and industrial equipment, nosed out of northern ports, bows pointed toward the Caribbean. Agricultural machinery.
Medium-range nuclear missiles destined for Fidel Castro's Cuba. Just as Khrushchev's peaceful coexistence was heralded by violent tirades directed at the world's diplomatic corps, his agricultural machinery was something else entirely. The bow had been lowered over Berlin, but the quiver was never empty.
Here's what this really comes down to. The 32nd Red Arrow Division story is not a story about a battle that was fought. It's a story about a battle that was prevented, and about how close the margin was. A constitutional prohibition that nearly left America defenseless. A legal framework built in 1947 that had never been tested. A Guard division from the American Midwest that had to be ready to cross the Atlantic in weeks. All of it assembled, under pressure, to send one message to one man in Moscow.
And the message landed. That's the thing about deterrence. When it works, nothing happens, and people forget to ask why. The Red Arrows came home without firing a shot, and that's exactly what success looked like. But it required everything: the legal architecture, the training, the forward deployment, the political will to mobilize in the first place. Remove any one of those pieces, and the outcome might have been very different.
The candy bombers over Tempelhof in 1948, the Red Arrows at Fort Lewis in 1961, different tools, same principle. You show up, you commit, you make the cost of aggression too high to pay.
And you do it before the shooting starts. That's the lesson that runs through this entire arc, from the original four-power agreement at Yalta all the way to the Red Arrows standing down in 1962. Berlin was the testing ground for whether the West had the resolve and the capability to back its commitments. Every time it was tested, the answer had to be yes, or the whole architecture collapsed. The bow was lowered, but as those Soviet freighters headed toward Cuba, the quiver was already being refilled. The next time you hear about a military mobilization that never turned into a deployment, remember the Red Arrows, because sometimes the most important thing a soldier does is make sure the fight never has to happen.